thank you everyone for coming to our Celebrate After Party webinar. This is called Designing Scenarios to Engage Students. And I'm Brian Lawfer and this is Dave Murphy from Learning Commons. So move to the next slide. Yep.
So we're going to talk about designing scenarios to engage students. We're going to go over a little bit about the purpose of why we do this. We always look at ourselves, instructional designers, as the hero, or sorry, the sidekicks. We're the faculty members. We consider you the heroes because you do a lot of the legwork and everything when it comes to designing courses. And we just like to use different techniques such as scenarios to help enhance what you guys do so you can do it better. Of course, we always are affiliated with the Quality Matters program. I don't know if I should say officially affiliated, but we're bought into it. We have to. It does a good job as far as making sure that we align our courses appropriately as we do them. So also please note that any examples used in this workshop are provided for informational purposes and do not represent licensed Quality Matters guidelines. I think that's important to note.
Okay, so we have 3 modules, learning objective for each module. So by the end of this workshop, you will define scenario-based learning and identify first principles instruction. We will analyze best practices in creating engaging scenarios, and then we'll summarize steps involved in building a scenario using the 3 C's of scenario building. So here's a look at the modules, all about scenarios, scenario creation tips, and building your scenario. So let's go ahead with the first module. And for each module, we have what we're calling a scenario break, which is an example of a scenario, and it is interactive. So if you could, in chat, you'll see that there are a couple of different options for each scenario step, and you can just use a number on your keypad and to vote, and we'll take a tally here and select what you would like to choose in the scenario. And these scenarios are designed to eventually direct the user around to the right answer. So they're kind of fun and funny, and you can feel free to choose a wrong answer to see where it will go. It's kind of like a choose your own adventure. Just switch over to the browser.
Yeah. I preloaded these in a browser so that we can go through them. So you all should see this first scenario. What would you do? The shop vac breaker. So we're going to go through this right now, right?
Yeah. So you plug in the shop vac's power cord into an electrical outlet, but when you turn the power switch to on, the sweeper does not run. So we have 3 choices there. Look around the room for what may be causing the problem, call the power company, or take apart the sweeper to find the problem. So which one would you guys like to pick for the first option here?
So just type in 1, 2, or 3 is the options. And just type it in the... Wow, we're tied. Oh, looks like 3's got more.
3. Okay, let's take apart the sweeper to find out what the problem might be. So it says, thank you. This thing never works. Maybe I can find the problem if I open the vacuum cleaner. So you take apart the sweeper, but cannot find what is causing the problem. So now we have 2 choices. Put the sweeper back together, then look around the room for what's causing the problem, or just throw the sweeper in the trash and be done with it.
So again, select 1 or 2.
Okay, looks like number 1 is winning here. So we'll go ahead and put the sweeper back together, and then look around the room for what may be causing the problem. So it says, thank you. You put the vacuum cleaner back together, but have a lot of leftover parts. Hopefully they are not essential. So again, it brings you back here. You look around the room and see a breaker with the door open inside the box. A breaker is in the off position, and you see a tag and a lock hanging from the breaker. You're pretty sure that this breaker is causing your problem. The lock appears to be disengaged. So what should you do here? Take the lock and the tag off, flip the breaker, and finish your quick 5-minute vacuuming job, or don't touch the breaker at all.
We need more voters. We're tied. Okay, thanks, Jim.
Okay.
Anyone else? I don't think everybody voted. If not, that's fine. Looks like 2 it is.
Looks like the consensus is 2, so let's not touch the breaker at all. So it says, thank you, I better not touch it. So you did the right thing. Congratulations, you did not touch the breaker and left your vacuuming job unfinished. According to lockout-tagout procedures, only the person who placed the lock on the breaker can remove it. Aren't you glad you followed the correct procedure? So we'll click yes. By not touching the breaker, I correctly followed OSHA regulations. And that is the end of that scenario break. I'm going to switch back.
Yeah, let's just switch back real quick. You all now should see the PowerPoint, correct? Good. So let's go over a little bit about what scenarios are and why we use them. Merriam-Webster described the scenarios as a description of what possibly could happen. So as you can see, as we went through that last scenario, you're given several different choices of what could happen. And of course, you saw the consequences of making those choices. So again, scenarios allow learners to apply the knowledge and skills that they've learned, and especially to apply them in relevant situations. Allow you to analyze issues, solve problems, make strategies about solving those problems, but you also learn through working through a structured activity that resembles a real-world challenge. And I think that's the benefit of using scenarios, is that it brings what you are teaching to the students in a real-life type of a situation, at least somewhat realistically, so they can apply the knowledge, and it forces them to apply it, or else they get something, I don't want to say something bad happens, but it shows the consequences, at least, of what would happen if they made a wrong choice.
So what is scenario-based learning? Well, it uses interactive scenarios to support interactive active learning strategies. It normally involves students working their ways through some kind of a storyline, usually based around a loosely structured or complex problem which they need to solve. In the process, students must apply their subject knowledge and critical thinking and problem-solving skills in a safe, real-world context. And scenario-based learning can also provide a lot of opportunities for feedback based on decisions that students make at each stage in the process.
So the big question is scenario-based learning the right option for you? So you get to ask yourself a few questions. For instance, do your outcomes involve a skill or a development problem solving or critical thinking? Is obtaining real-world experience unsafe or unreasonable? That's why using something that's simulated is probably the best deal. You know, I did a scenario on an accident with safety management, which can be pretty gruesome. So doing things in a scenario is far more safer than going into the shop and actually investigating the accident. Although, albeit they'd be safe, it's just you want to save them the blood and gore doing the scenario first. So it's a lot more reasonable to do it online first. And then you want to ask yourself, do the learners need to use related knowledge to assist their decision making? That's something that you want to consider as well when you build these. And But I think another important question is, do you have the capacity to design, create, and test a scenario? We use software that we're provided through the university. It can be pretty expensive, but I think we also have some other options out there that very cost effective that will allow you to create something. And in fact, even if you're very good at PowerPoint, you can create scenarios within PowerPoint too. So there's a lot of options out there, but we use, well, Adobe Captivate is one, and then Brian and I always use Articulate Storyline to create our scenarios, and it works really well. But we'll cover software a little bit later on.
So the first principles of instruction diagram you see here is kind of divided into four with the main thing in the middle there. So it's a set of interrelated principles that, when properly applied, can increase student learning. So you have your task problem-centered in the middle there, which students, they learn more with real-world tasks or problems that progress from simple to complex. With activation, students learn more when they're directed to recall prior knowledge, recall a structure for organizing that knowledge, or given a structure for organizing some new knowledge. And then, of course, demonstration. It's presented to them in the context of the real-world tasks or problems. Applications, students learn more when they are able to solve real-world problems and receive feedback and appropriate guidance during that application. And then, of course, integration. Students can integrate their new knowledge into their real life through reflection, discussion, debate. So if you follow these principles in the cycle of instruction, beginning with activation, you can continue through all the steps, and that should help a lot.
On to the next slide. So we're also looking, in these scenarios, we're looking at 3 areas of student engagement. This is something that you might find familiar from if you're used to Quality Matters. So 3 types of activities are student to instructor engagement, which elicits feedback from the instructor to the student to content engagement. This is typically a way that we engage with students. It's typically also scenarios engage with students and student to content. This is something that is typical of all online courses and so forth. But the third one is student to student engagement. That is where we can use collaborative learning in a good atmosphere. These 3 areas of engagement can be touched by using scenarios. So a scenario, it's not like a cure-all for these 3 types of engagement, but it does help, and it does work very well in all 3 areas.
Okay, so we have a couple different discussion breaks here. So if you could type in the chat and just give us an idea of some of your personal experience with scenarios. If you could share an example of your favorite scenario developed by you or someone else. And did it include dead ends, or did it direct the learner toward the correct answer like the one we tried earlier? Or do you remember anything else about it that made it special? Just in a few sentences, if you could. Or I suppose we could unmute people if they want to.
Yeah, or if you just want to speak up, we can unmute you, but that's fine too. So Linda says, I think we use scenarios in the Title IX training. Who did that? I think we did.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I remember scenarios being made for that.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to unmute everybody, actually, if you just want to chime in or type out how you've used scenarios.
This is Marcia. I used to work for Urban Search and Rescue, which is the elite emergency response group with FEMA. FEMA is not a bad word all the time. And we did week-long trainings on structural collapse. And at the end, on Friday, we had a full-blown activity where we were actually doing breaching, breaking, cutting and burning, communications. We all had our stations. It was all scenario-based, and it was all very dangerous because we were really using, the real equipment. But as you said earlier, better that than in a real event learning. So very effective. I like scenarios.
Good. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, simulating something that you may or may not have to go through in real life, especially when there's danger involved, I think doing a scenario is far better. Being that if you're in a situation where there is something dangerous, panic can set in, and you have to rely on training. And if you're relying on, well, I remember the book said X, Y, Z, it might not cut it. But if you've done that, and if you have, especially if it's something physical, I think it's really important. Yeah, doing the scenario is good. So Becky said food handlers training, very good use of scenarios in various ways. Good. If you want to chime in and explain that a little further, that would be great. Jenna Martin said, I worked on a scenario for the business school about employment discrimination. There's a dead end for students to the process. And what made it special was that there were lots of mini decisions being made along the way. Good, interesting. I've been through scenarios where I hit dead ends, and sometimes it got frustrating. But it's nice to have that decision where you're somewhat in control, right? And you do hit that dead end, as long as you can realize why and maybe where you went wrong and go back and remake your choice. I think those are really good. There's one out there that from Ray Jimenez. It was how to negotiate. And if you want to Google Ray Jimenez, it's really fun, but it took me 2 hours to get through it because I kept hitting these dead ends going, I know I'm selecting the right choice, but I wasn't. I didn't have the precursor knowledge for that particular scenario, but you have to negotiate with a homeless man who's asking for help. And you just can't give him the money either. You have to negotiate with him and do it right. So that was very interesting. See if anybody else said anything. Good. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Move on.
Yeah. I'm not on the right one.
Okay, Module 2 is called Scenario Creation Tips. And I think this is another scenario break here, if you want to switch over. Okay, does everyone see the new scenario here? It's called What Would You Do? Hallway Liquid. So as you walk through one of the halls in an academic building, you come across a locked room where a puddle of something is spreading out into the hallway. It doesn't look like rusty water. What should you do? Call someone who has more information, taste the liquid, or mop up the liquid. And remember, some of these are humorous to make it more memorable and direct people to do the right thing eventually.
So far we have number 1. Jenna, thank you for being adventurous with Taste the Liquid.
Why don't we go ahead and taste it and see what happens.
I'm so thirsty.
This could be a bad decision. Okay, it says thank you, and the Darwin Award goes to. So we go ahead and taste the liquid. So you dip your index finger in the liquid and taste it. It tastes funny. What should you do with it? Call your supervisor, number 1, or number 2, funny equals delicious. Let's drink the rest of the liquid.
All right, Jenna.
Marcia's another option. Get out the hazmat suits. I like that.
All right. It looks like everybody's choosing one, so I suppose we'll have to.
Let's be responsible here and call our supervisor. So it says good idea. So you decide to call and report the incident to your supervisor. He has keys to all the locks in your building. He can open the room to take a look at the liquid spilling out under the door. Aren't you glad you made the right decision? So the only choice here it directs you to is yes. Once the liquid is identified, my supervisor will determine the potential health hazards by referring to the MSDS for that particular substance. So we choose that, and it takes us to the end of the scenario here, and you do have an option to review it. And keep in mind, you can try these out on your own using the link in the PowerPoint, which we'll be sending out later.
Yes. So what are the common events of a good story? I don't think I have that. All right, so as you can see here, the common events of the good story, we have characters, events, setups, characters, conversations, emotions, conflicts, choices, consequences, resolutions, and discoveries.
Okay, some of the core characteristics for scenario-based learning. We have realism, learner-centric, applied learning strategies, and interactive. So, of course, realism is important to make it realistic as possible while still providing students with required information. With learner-centric, we want to draw upon learners' core strengths and allow them to use skill sets that they're developing while also allowing them to improve upon their weak points. And each scenario should really involve skills or knowledge that students have already gathered and which can be applied to the current task so they can learn by doing. And of course, interactive helps to fully immerse students in the scenario.
So what are the key traits of some of the simulations? Well, you want to make it somewhat authentic. Of course, you want to give them the chance to make realistic decisions. Now, we put in a little bit of humor, and it might not be realistic to taste the liquid. I guess you never know, but you put it in there. Sometimes the humor, I guess it lowers down the learning barriers that might be out there if somebody doesn't want to do it or something. I think it does at least. But the other thing, number 3 we have is accurate depictions of the consequences. You want to have something at least remotely accurate of what might happen if they choose the wrong decision, and especially if they choose the right decision. But also, you want to have constructive comments and remediation when an undesirable action or option is selected. Going back to Ray Jimenez's negotiation scenario that we did, some of the what was hard about that scenario is I didn't have any constructive comments or remediation to figure out why I kept getting hit over the head by this homeless person who I was trying to give money to. So sometimes you have to be careful of overdoing it in that it might be too hard. So I always like to make the choices in a way where once they see the consequence of the choice, if it's a bad choice, they can go back, or I might remove one of the options and saying, well, that didn't work out, did it? Here's some of the other choices that you have. And I think you do something similar too, Brian. Is that right?
Yeah. Try to direct them to the right thing eventually.
Yeah.
And Chanel says that the Cognito training does a great job with depiction of consequences. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I am. I think that's the training that the Wellness Center uses. Is that?
Okay.
So they'll have different situations for talking somebody down from suicide or something like that, and they're well done.
Interesting. So components of effective scenarios presents a situation, problem, or issue related to the learning outcomes. The content should be connected to the task. It should model real-life thinking processes that the learner has to be able to perform. Events should be arranged in a logical order with clear choices, and it should be sufficiently complete, complex, and focused. And of course, the content must be accurate, relevant, and appropriate. So these are all things that, kind of like a checklist to make sure go in your scenario.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about improving engagement and understanding. Scenarios can really help with motivation. They can motivate the learners. It places the challenges in front and center for the learner to make that choice. They also are able to become aware of the tools that are involved with making those choices and able to solve the problem or the issue in the scenario. It also shows that feedback, which is pretty immediate. Either it's somewhat realistic. We want them to see the rewards or the consequences of making the choices that they have. But we also want to challenge the learners without overwhelming them. So we have a little bit of cognitive scaffolding going on with these scenarios, in that we don't overwhelm them, but we give them choices, and that enables them to use the knowledge that they've had. And we want to expand that, as the note says, we want to expand that knowledge without overloading them.
So some ways to use scenarios: you could tell the story, then pose questions. You might keep it short, keep the story sharp. It's just easier for you to keep track of. The more complex it gets, the more work it is for you. You can ask a series of questions to go a little bit deeper, confirm understanding, and forge a memorable connection in the learner's brain. You can ask questions during the scenario. So in a conversation, you can stop and ask for the learner's input. So you could say, Bill is unsure how to proceed. What would you recommend he do now? Or, did Emma take the correct action by contacting her supervisor? And customized feedback for each response helps you address common mistakes and misperceptions. And you can also use questions for branching, such as establishing the correct route. Remember, we learn from our mistakes, so let the learner make mistakes and direct them back toward the right answer, like we did earlier, with a little bit of fun and humor. And as you design a branching program, first, it would probably help in your planning to set out the perfect route first. So that is, go through the entire scenario the right way and get that documented, and then go do some critical error analysis to find those natural points where the learners would diverge. And it depends on the software you're using, but tools like Articulate support branching questions, so you don't feel like this approach is out of reach from a technical perspective. It should be doable.
Mm-hmm. Jenna asks, can we ask pen-ended questions within the confines of eCampus? Oh, I was like, are you asking for like, sorry, pen-ended question? Thanks. Open-ended questions within the confines of eCampus. I thought they had to be binary. So I wouldn't do a scenario like this using eCampus as the tool to do the scenario. Like we mentioned, we use, I mean, you could use it in PowerPoint, but that's not going to record the answers or anything. I've done scenarios where I've given them a scenario to go through and then had them discuss what had happened in the scenario. And I use this in a way I call it a little bit of cognitive friction. There's no good answer to the scenario. And so it can be frustrating. And I mentioned that in the scenario that, all right, this is the end. Go ahead and discuss with your peers. And then they'll able to do that as a discussion in eCampus. But as a tool to create the scenario completely, it just doesn't have the capacity to do that.
And we do go over a few more options for software, a few more slides down the road here.
Yep. Let's go to the next slide, unless there's any other questions. All right, so let's discuss this. Have you ever written or used any scenarios in your classes? And if so, how did your experience turn out? And if not, what were some of the hurdles and obstacles that you had encountered? And this can be from if you've created a scenario, or it could also be if you participated in a scenario. And some of you have participated in some. So just go ahead and, I'll turn on the microphone so you guys, if you want to speak up, you can, or just go ahead and type it out.
Well, everybody's being quiet. I've written scenarios with teams of people. Again, going back to my urban search and rescue days, the SMEs were there and they had the in-field experience, and then we wrote scenarios, and I kept it on track for learning outcomes and what we could do out on the training field. And so the SMEs gave me the information and told me what was realistic.
So, Marcia, what did you use, what type of software did you use for the scenarios?
Well, no, this was on real training.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. Yeah, so it was a real live training where you set it up and act it out?
Yeah, we were out on the training field in uniform and doing the real stuff.
Very good. And that's not too different from doing it online either, in that you give them choices. You could probably recreate all of that online using some of the software.
I want to learn how to do that. I need to learn how to do this and recreate it all online.
Good, good.
So
go ahead.
Can you upload the files to Blackboard that Articulate creates?
Yeah, Articulate will create it in are you asking what type of files it creates, or you want us to upload the files that we use?
That's what it's compatible with Blackboard.
It is. You can output it as a Flash file, or you can output it as HTML5.
Okay.
And even in HTML5, you can include audio, video, just about everything. HTML5, all the animations work. It's really nice. So Jenna writes, we use scenarios all the time in law school. The biggest hurdle that we have encountered is the limitations of the software. I'm really curious to how we can use it within eCampus. It depends on the software that you're using. What you see here, what we've been doing here, all these are scenarios that Brian has created is a training with...
It was a facilities and services new orientation training for new employees, and it was created in Articulate Studio using Quizmaker. So Storyline or Studio for Articulate should work.
So we use a lot of Articulate here, but I believe that, well, I'm not sure, but we do have access to Adobe Captivate, which it does everything Articulate does. You may have access to it, you may have to have your department pay for it, but we have this whole Adobe Studio thing going on. It's a contract we have through WVU. I don't think it's included in that, but I
don't think it's in the Creative Clouds.
No, I don't think it is. But we have several people here that use it. I've looked at both of those, and they do the exact same thing, just in different ways. I like Articulate because it seems to be a little bit simpler for me.
A little bit more user-friendly, at least from my experience.
Yeah, the Brainiacs, Lydia, and our other colleagues use Captivate. I shouldn't say that because it's not hard to use. So.
Well, if it's available, we have available to us.
All right, let's go on to the next slide.
Okay, this is the next module, the third module, building your scenario. So just like with the other ones, we'll start off with a scenario what would you do? If you could switch over. Okay, what would you do, hallway computer? While walking through a building, you see a computer sitting in the hallway outside of an office. There are no visible markings or stickers on it. Apparently it's trash, right? Do you take it with you? So you can choose, yes, it looks like an old computer that no one is using. They'll probably throw it out, so I'll just take it home for myself instead. Or, no, I should think about this more carefully. What do you want to choose? 1 or 2?
Well, I personally would like number 1 because I'm doing my own array for like a 3D printing type of a situation. You know, that way I have a lot of computations I can do and print stuff out.
So would you like to take the computer?
I want, they're not using it.
All right, let's take the computer, since no one wants it anyway. You pick up the computer, go out the door, and head toward your vehicle. So you take the computer and load it into your car. Out of the corner of your eye, you see several people looking over in your direction. On the way home, you have second thoughts about what you did. What now? Turn around, take the computer back to WVU, and return it to the hallway where you found it, or go home with the computer. So we're at another decision point here. Should we keep going? Just go home with it? Why don't we go home and see what happens?
All right.
And step on it. Let's get home quickly. So when you arrive at your house, you take the computer out of your trunk and notice WVU serial numbers on the case. This equipment can be tracked by these numbers, and someone will be looking for this computer. Suddenly your cell phone rings. Do you answer it? So just put the computer back in the trunk, jump in the car and return it to where you found it, or answer the phone. So we have another decision point here.
Looks like everybody's choosing 1.
All right, at this point, let's put the computer back in the trunk. So thank you. Maybe you can make it back before anyone notices something is missing. So in the end, you put the computer back, it sits in the hallway near an office. Aren't you glad you didn't move it? So the only option it directs us to here is yes, the computer, even if it appears to be old or unused, is still property of WVU. If the computer is no longer being used, the person who used it should make arrangements to transfer it to surplus. And we successfully navigated that scenario.
So how do we start when we start looking at these scenarios? You know, some of the first thing we need to do when we start, and this is typical of course design in general, is to identify the learning outcomes. You want to know what the student has to achieve. And for me, I like to list that out and work backwards and craft a situation that leads to learning. You're also going to look at the media types, the formats. Are you going to use images or are you going to use video? I was showing a colleague of ours, Lydia, one that I did for safety management, and talked about how I wanted to use video in it, but we talked about it and how expensive it might be. Even though we have all the equipment, we have the studio and everything that we could do, the amount of time that it takes to do video is actually not as cost effective as if I would have put in similar to these scenarios that you've seen here, just graphics and choices and so forth. Video is not a forgiving medium. If you make a mistake and have to edit it out or anything, it's a little bit harder to do. Secondly, though, are you going to include supporting activities such as wikis or discussions? I like to create, for eCampus, I like to create a scenario. Sometimes they're open-ended. Sometimes being open-ended, it makes people want to discuss it because they can't resolve that situation right off, and they want to know why. You got to be careful with that because it's supposed to cause frustration, so you let your students know there may not be a good answer to this, but you want to discuss it. That's one thing I do. Another thing that I've done is have the scenario where it's simulating, I've done several of these for safety management, where it simulates a situation and they have to take a document that they've downloaded, and while they go through the scenario, they have to outline or fill out this document that asks questions. So for accident investigation, they had to go investigate an accident with somebody getting caught into a lathe, and we have video footage. It's not gory, but it's good enough to actually go, oh wow, that would have hurt. And they have to interview different characters, and they have to fill out the different things on this form as they go and do this scenario. Again, video would have worked as well, but doing just text and pictures worked just fine. So also just making sure that you select the right topic and you determine the trigger events or the situations. And Brian, you can talk about this too, but as we go through, I really like to outline the successful track of what somebody would successfully do, the choices that would create the success in the end. But then I think of like, well, what if they didn't choose? What would be another option? And then I can kind of branch out from there. What we call branching scenarios, which is what we're talking about now, that can become overwhelming if you give too many choices. And if you don't prune it down, in essence, so that they can actually make the right choice. It can be frustrating. It can take a long time to get through it, and especially a long time to build it as well.
They can get very messy in the planning process. If you plan out too many decision points, too many things like that, it can just get overwhelming. So keep in mind your capacity.
Yeah, yeah. And then the last on that is obtaining feedback. What would you say about that, about obtaining feedback, Brian? This is in reference to getting the feedback within the scenario itself of what the choices that they make.
Well, and also have people test it out, get feedback from your peers, make sure everything works right. It's like testing software. You want to test every possible combination of things that could go wrong to make sure that there aren't those dead ends and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, doing that, I think it makes it, your scenario, it can be robust, but not overwhelming, which is what you don't want it to be too overwhelming.
Okay, here's the slide where we have a number of possible programs that could be used for building scenarios. There is the Articulate products we have listed first. Articulate Studio 13, I believe, is the current version of Articulate Studio, and that includes Articulate Engage and Quizmaker and some other products. Quizmaker allows you to make scenarios because people can choose from different answers, which you can use for branching scenarios. Articulate Storyline offers you a lot more freedom. It's kind of on a higher level skill-wise, I would say, more like Captivate.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very free form. You can create your own scenarios with that. And they do have some templates available.
They do, and one thing I like about Storyline too is that you can look at how your scenario is branching from a bird's eye view. And that's kind of nice because sometimes I'll be going through and I'm like, this isn't going the way that I thought it would. And I can look at the bird's eye view and say, oh, somehow I didn't connect this branch to over here, so then I can look at what I've been doing and correct it. So that is nice to do that. And to tell you the truth, before I usually do any of this inside any of these softwares, I might outline it on paper first just to get, a whiteboard is really good to have too, that you can, have something where you draw out the branches and the choices and so forth and say, oh, what would I do here? This is going to lead here. It's just a way of outlining it first, and I usually do that. Becky asks, how about Qualtrics? Does a nice job with branching. Would you put the link into a course? Becky, are you referring to using Qualtrics as the software to branch out? You might be able to do that. I haven't played with Qualtrics that much. Although, I don't know, it'd be nice because you could calculate how many people made what choice.
Gather statistics on.
I don't know enough about Qualtrics to see and I'm very visual, so I like a lot of graphics and maybe even videos. So I don't know, might be possible. I'd like to play with it now just to see what I could do and see statistically of the choices that people make. I think that's a good.
Yeah, if you happen to try it out and have any success with it, let us know and we'll add it to the list here.
Yep.
Okay. I think it does a nice job with branching, and you can put images in, and I mean it's robust. Every time I use it, I'm amazed at what it can do.
Wow, good.
I think that's an interesting way of going about
Building
it.
one, yeah.
Yeah.
And right above that, Marcia asked, does what you create in Quizmaker then integrate into eCampus? Or I guess we already answered that, but yeah, yes, you can integrate it into eCampus.
And with either of these, in Storyline, anything using Articulate, you can, and I'm sure with Adobe Captivate as well, anything from Adobe, if you put it in there, if it's SCORM compliant, you can transfer that score that they achieve in Quizmaker or Storyline over to eCampus, so you can see what people, if you're doing it in a way that it would record a score, through SCORM you can put that into your gradebook in eCampus. So that's a nice addition as well.
Some other software, we went over Captivate. You can, in PowerPoint, you can make branching scenarios. You can make images that are clickable. So you can have an image lead to one slide and then click on another image and it leads to another slide. Apple Keynote is basically Apple's version of PowerPoint, so it's possible there too. And then there's software like Twine and Microsoft Visio, Inspiration, and you could design your own HTML pages and make them into branching scenarios. So there are many possibilities.
If you haven't checked out Twine, I think that's free, isn't it?
I think so. I haven't used it in a while.
Yeah, I haven't either. That's one that's more text-based, but it's really nice to just start typing and seeing where things might branch off. That Twine really reminds me of the old Choose Your Own Adventure books that I used to read as a kid. So Twine's really nice to use.
So there are also random scenario generators. These really help just with generating some ideas when your mind is blank. So you can try writing exercises, random scenario generator. Whenever we give you the PowerPoint, you can click on these links and you can click a generate a scenario button, which may not be that great. It may not be that useful, but it might be a jumping off point and give you ideas for how you want to build your scenario. There's a number of entries on our blog, our iDesign e-learning blog, that have some links to some different scenario generators, so if you want to check those out. So you can just click generate and it'll come up with scenarios. One example is you've been granted one wish that could make the world a better place. What would you wish for? So that you could jump off from there and create all kinds of branches, I'm sure.
Yep, very nice. All right, let's go over the 3 C's of scenario building. So the first C is challenge. You want to make sure that the learner is challenged to make good choices. The second one is choice. So once you give them the challenge, you give them the scenario of what, it's the conflict that's going on, you can give them a choice of what they can do about it. Of course, the choice leads to different consequences, which that's going to give them that immediate feedback that they want. Those consequences and preventing that feedback can lead on to more choices. Again, if you're using a branching scenario, that can get a bit out there if you're not careful, but you don't have to go crazy with it. So, but having that consequences, providing that immediate feedback is really important.
So now you're going to be building your scenario, and so you want to arrange all the pieces in the correct place. So think of it like a puzzle or like a board game where you want to have all the pieces in the correct place. You want to create your characters or avatars. How do you want to do that? Photographic, cartoonish. What kind of roles are they going to have? Is it going to be like an avatar in the corner serving as a guide? Then you want to set the stage. So how are you going to do that? You can create some images using separate software or use tools within the program you're using to create some simple images in just a few minutes. PowerPoint has a lot of things you can choose from built in. So do these other programs typically. Then you want to construct your narrative. So when plotting out your story, you want to determine the major decision points and decide if you want a linear scenario that progresses from one stage to another, or some kind of a single series of sequential steps, or some kind of non-linear branching scenario.
Brian, one thing that I've done too is I've created what's called mini scenarios. A lot of old school scenario building really just involves one question that gives a situation and the student answers like in a discussion post or something like that. And that's totally fine. We're talking more of, branching scenarios, which are far more robust, but really, give more choices, more consequences, and so forth. But a mini scenario is kind of in between, where you have basically a few questions, and you might choose through a few things, but then it's not going to branch out. It's going to end pretty quickly. And these are the ones I usually use that would actually have them post things in a discussion board and the like. So, it's really nice to, I guess, gauge that upon what you want your students to do and what you want them to achieve. But also it goes back to, what type of tools you have, how realistic it's going to be, and that sort of thing. Because you can make it, again, we've said this before, overwhelming, or you can make it pretty simple. And I've wanted to use video in them, but that might take up a lot of time. But using these cartoon characters and so forth, that works just as well too. So storyboarding. We've talked a little bit about this, but this is one way to really hash out your scenario in a way that's not too costly, if that's the right way to put it. So you want to be able to visualize your interactions. I like to do it in a comic book style. Of course, what we see here is pretty robust, but basically we're talking about using it in simple ways, and depending on the tool you have, you can do something similar to this graphic, or I can just use paper and pen. That works just as good. You can draw a series of frames with short descriptions, and from those, usually I draw out, okay, what are they going, what choices do they have, what choices are they going to make. Most importantly, though, I want to concentrate on the functionality. And once I get my ideas of the scenario out, and by storyboarding it, again, you can use software to do it, you can use a whiteboard, or I often use paper and pen. Something that's easy to change and mess around, but don't worry about designing the interface first off. Just get the story in place and the choices, and then once you go into the software, whatever software you choose or that you have, then you can make it a little bit more robust.
Okay, so now we're building our scenario and we're designing a branching scenario. So some of the things you want to keep in mind with the branching scenario in particular, you want to identify the highest priority decisions you want learners to practice. Then you want to come up with a basic story idea and protagonist. We find that subject matter experts are a great source of information for this kind of thing. Then you want to flesh out the plot of the story using a flow chart or even like concept mapping type software, while keeping in mind the debrief questions you'll want to ask. And then you want to write a very detailed script.
So scripting is really important. It's important to get things out and fleshed out before you actually, especially if you're going to do it with video or audio, you want to get that out first, so you're eliminating a lot of mistakes that could happen. But having a script is really helpful. So let's talk a little bit about the branching design tips. So you want to make sure that the challenge is important to the learners. Raise the stakes a little bit. You also want to eliminate the paths to failure and make them into short dead ends. Like I think we've said this a couple of times already, if there's too many dead ends, users are going to get frustrated. They're going to wonder why, I can't figure this out. And I've heard some people complain that they just don't want to go through a scenario that's going to take 2 hours to complete, and a lot of frustration. So you don't want to have too many paths to failure, but you want to make it realistic at the same time. You want to make the choices integral to this whole story so that it follows a good path, and it's important to what they're going to learn to achieve that objective. A few surprises here and there that might be unexpected really throws a wrench into the system, and sometimes that's effective too. Again, if it's funny, if it's exciting, sometimes that just gets them more interested into the scenario itself, and it's not as boring.
And continuing on with that one, some other techniques create a feel of time passing. So just advancing to the next slide, structure can give a feeling of time passing, can add to the narrative feel. You can throw in some no consequence decisions for the learner, because sometimes learners overanalyze every option and decision. So you can put them at ease with a couple no consequence decisions, like allowing them to pick whether a character drinks juice or soda or prefers cats or dogs. You want to embed important background content in later slides or dialogue choices. So you don't want to waste your learners' time with lots of introductory or expository info that they're just reading and reading. You want to keep it kind of short. Keep names descriptive and backstories light. Again, just the essentials. And break up long passages to move the learner along. So try not to make them read too much before they come to a decision point or something interesting to see or look at.
If you do have to have a lot of context out there, that might be a part where you do have a small 30-second video that quickly explains things. Most people, if they're online, they tend to scan things more than do a lot of deep reading. So, you want to keep that somewhat to a minimum. Of course, all of that information can be prefaced, or the information needed for the scenario can be within the lesson beforehand. So an example is in eCampus, some of what we do, the things that we do is we have that information given out in the regular pages, and then we have that scenario that is supposed to test them on what they've learned. And it's testing them, I guess I should put that in air quotes, because it's not like an exam, some formative assessment, but I would say that, or summative, I would say this is more of a formative assessment going through the scenario, and it's a little bit easier than a regular, multiple choice quiz. All right, so we can talk a little bit about mapping out the scenario. Once you've gone through the basic decision points and so forth, as I mentioned, and you can see it looks like here that they have it on a little whiteboard. I like using whiteboards because it's just so forgiving when you just erase something. But we like to branch things out, define the starting and the ending points, drawing boxes and lines to the next section. And then just map out the decisions directly that lead to successful outcome, lead to unsuccessful outcomes. That way you're kind of fleshing it out before you actually do any of the programming in whatever software that you're going to use. And I say programming, I guess, lightly, that it's not like you're cranking out code or anything, unless you're going to use like PHP or something. I've done that before, and it's effective, but if that's your way of doing things, that's fine. But doing this also, mapping it out first, make sure that you are matching the objectives that you're using in your scenario, the objectives and the framework of the whole lesson. That's really important because you want to make sure that they're achieving those objectives through your scenario.
So as you're creating this in whatever program you choose, some tips on navigation. You want to be able to control where you want the learner to go, and sometimes that means limiting their navigation options. If you have a next or forward button that doesn't really do anything, for instance in Articulate, you can take those out, so there's no need for them to click on it. Or if you want somebody to perform an action, if you want them to click on a button or an image on the screen and not use those next or back buttons, go ahead and remove them and direct them to click at something on the screen. It also allows learners, you can allow learners to start over, add a restart or a start over button. So if they make a mistake or if they want to go back, they can reconsider some of their decisions. And it'll make your life easier if you consider a simple structure for this. Complex structures can be harder to manage, and they increase the time needed to complete the scenario and your time to make the scenario. So keep all of that in mind.
So let's talk about making sure that you're communicating the right message. You want to impart some of the information during the scenario setup. So for example, you can say something like the ADA enacted by Congress in 1990 states, and that gives a preface of what you're going to be talking about, and maybe some rules that would affect the choices in the scenario. You want to add some information to the feedback as far as if they make a correct or incorrect choice. For instance, on the scenarios that we were doing here, you always had, thank you, and then it gave like some feedback of, yeah, that was the right decision. Some of that feedback's important, especially as they go through it, that they know they're making the right or the wrong choices. And additionally, you want to provide some help opportunities. You can add additional links and resources, sometimes have a virtual assistant. One thing that I've done also is that if it's obvious that they're not getting to the right section, you can have a little help button and they can click on that, and that can remind them of some of the information that they need to use. So for instance, in a funds handling course, I have a section where if they get so many, what it is the scenario in the lesson structure, they were guided on how to handle money here at WVU. And if they're going to deposit that money into the bank, what are the paperwork, the slips, and everything that they need to include. And it's pretty complex. There's a yellow slip, they're filling out this form, they have a yellow and a pink slip. Do you use both? What do you do with the white slip? Where does that go? So going through that in the scenario beforehand in this training allows them to, again, recall and see if they can do it. But if they get it wrong, and we all know that some students, me included, will just really cruise through some of these instructions and, all right, let's get on with it. But then when I make the wrong choice and I'm stuck, I have a little help button that's there that can click back and it say, remember, these are the things that need to go in the deposit bag. And they can review those instructions. So it's kind of like a remedial reminder if they had missed instruction, and then go back and can make the right choice. Doing that really helps them retain what they have learned, because there's a little bit of that cognitive friction there, and because they have that, their mind's a little bit more open to picking up that knowledge so they can get through the situation, the scenario, so to speak. All right, let's go to the next slide.
So summarizing some of the things we talked about today, we have some do's and don'ts. So you do want to ensure that there are direct and real consequences for major actions the learner takes. You do want decision points to make students think carefully about the options available before choosing one. And this requires each option to be plausible and relevant. You want to allow the learner to go back into time when they choose, not only when presenting the scenario, but also at any other point, so they can stop going down a branch of a decision tree the moment they realize they're going wrong. And this mimics real life closely. It's because you'd stop whatever you're doing in real life and change course if you knew it was the wrong way to go. Some of the don'ts: you don't want to underestimate your learner's intelligence. You don't want to add too many decision points, as it'll make the scenario unmanageable or uninteresting. You don't want to provide feedback without remediation. The designer can write customized remedial feedback for each option, like you saw I did in the scenarios, like whenever we'd click and then it would say, and the Darwin Award goes to, or something like that. So I think that helps too.
So once you start creating this, how do you wrap your scenario up? So again, and part of this you want to do in just the mapping it out before you start programming. You want to identify the loopholes. You want to identify the gaps. Are there any missing steps or choices or unintentional dead ends? Sometimes I get excited about, just creating the story as it goes along, and I end up with some unintentional dead ends, and so you have to correct those. You have to get rid of those so that it doesn't end up with, because that dead end has to be resolved. They have to do something to get back to where they can make another correct choice. Then, once you've mapped everything out, you've cut back or pruned back any of the dead ends and the gaps and so forth, any of the loopholes. Make sure that you publish to the needed format. You publish your scenario to the needed format. Typically, we do it in Articulate Storyline. They have like a Flash output and HTML5 output. Because I'm having such problems in my browsers with using Flash, I'm just outputting it to HTML5. But Flash actually plays a little bit better. That's not just Storyline, that's just Flash. It's pretty good. It's a little bit better than HTML5. HTML5 is catching up, but I don't know, I hate to see Flash going down.
I know.
The way it is.
You can always just include links for whichever version people have.
Yeah, and Storyline does that. It's supposed to detect it in the browser, and then if they're not Flash enabled, then it goes to the HTML5. I've got Flash enabled, but it always crashes. I use Firefox most of the time. It always crashes Firefox. Chrome does great, so there you go. But then again, the last thing on here that we have listed is to ensure that your scenario outcomes aligns with the objectives. And you want to do that throughout this whole process. But it's always good to get a second pair of eyes, get somebody else and say, all right, I created this scenario, and what do you think? Does it fit? So Brian and I, we often will it's probably me going to Brian more saying, Brian, what do you think? I don't know, I'm tired. And then we have a bunch of people here. We're very fortunate to work around a lot of really smart people that can check things out. And there's, whenever I go to Lydia, she always points out something that just I totally missed, and I totally missed it, and I was like, well, that's a good point. I better put that back in there, or I have to weigh it to see if it's important or not. But you want to double check that.
And we have a great team that really helps a lot.
Oh yeah.
So, any questions before we show you a list of resources?
I'm going to unmute everybody, so if you want to speak up or just type in the chat.
And we will be sending this out later, a link, so everybody can review the PowerPoint.
So who was it that suggested Qualtrics? I'm going to try that.
I'm intrigued.
I did. Becky?
Becky, thank you.
You're welcome.
And if you want, if you've already played with it, go ahead and create something simple or whatever, and share it with us. We'll email it to everybody if you want, or just with us, whatever. I think it would be interesting because Qualtrics is really nice that you could just send out a link to a number of people and say, all right, what do you think? I'm interested because one thing about Articulate is that you can print out in, I think it outputs everything in Word. If you want to publish to Word, you can do that, and then you can copy and paste those graphics into Qualtrics.
That'd be a good way to do it. Interesting.
Yeah, I would be really, now I'm interested in doing that, because then you can test out your survey or your scenario.
We should be able to put the link directly in eCampus to open in a new window. My concern is, can we get results into the gradebook from Qualtrics? I don't know. I don't know what it would take to make that happen.
Well, I don't know if you can import, but you can definitely export from Qualtrics. So if you could import a CSV file in a certain format, you'd have to be careful, you know, what fields you include and all.
And then we can upload. I've never done that in eCampus. We can upload into the gradebook, can we not? Huh.
I would think.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
You know, if you are doing it in Articulate or Captivate Studio, yeah, Captivate, not Captivate. It's Articulate Studio and then Adobe Captivate. I know that if you have your scenario, and I think you can do this in either of them, where they get a certain amount of points, you can create a variable that, you know, depending on what page they eventually go to, it generates a certain amount of points. You can export that, and it can go to the gradebook through SCORM. So that's one thing that you can do to see where they ended up. I don't know, but Qualtrics might be a little bit more. I mean, if it's a CSV file, I'm sure you can upload it.
I don't think it's SCORM based. I mean, it's a branching a survey for creating surveys, and it's wonderful. But I don't think it's SCORM based.
I don't think it has anything to do with SCORM, but again, if it outputs as a CSV file, which you can import into, but that's for spreadsheeting and so forth. So that's something that I would look into to see if it can import that information into Campus.
Yeah, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, it would be
Seems like it
interesting.
should be possible.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens.
Yeah, and again, with some of this, you might just want to be looking at what users chose, that sort of thing. I don't know if using it as a score for them to, you know, if you're going to score a grade on how successfully they were at the scenario. I've not done that. I've just used it to stimulate discussions. But it's interesting. I mean, you want to, usually this would be more of a summative type of or a formative assessment that they might discuss. But I've never thought about importing their score into eCampus to see how they actually did.
Oh, I was thinking about it as an activity that is used also as an assessment, aligned directly with certain learning outcomes. Huh.
Yep. I mean, we've been talking about that you do want to do that, but as far as making it an assessment that we actually measure, we talk about it, but I've never used it as a score within the gradebook. Usually it's something we've just discussed, or they had to hand in something. So I think the questions that you're asking are really putting the flame underneath us to do what we say we do.
Let's get that flint out.
Any other questions, comments?
Here's a list of resources that we hope will be helpful. And if you came to our Celebrate conference yesterday, thank you very much. And thank you for coming to the after party today. So we have the Celebrate link, we have the Teaching and Learning Commons, our website, also our iDesign website, and that the blog I was talking about earlier with lots of helpful entries related to teaching and learning. And it has the random scenario generators, it has learning objective generator posts I've done, lots of different things. That's an interesting.
Yeah.
Never seen that.
Thank you, guys. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Attending.
Thank you.
Bye. Yeah, it is.
It's the last slide. It doesn't have much on it.
Yeah. Degrading audio. Is my audio degrading? Do you feel less of a person? Sorry.
Good thing that didn't happen till the end.
All right.
Okay, we need to stop the recording, I guess, and then I don't know what happens to it.